In the 1980s and early 90s, sprite scaling was something of a big deal. Save for a few cases of really expensive home hardware, most games that impressively used the technology were limited to the arcade. And even when a home system was capable of it at a specialized level, it was nowhere near as potent or impressive as its coin-op cousins. For those of you wondering exactly what sprite scaling is, it's basically where a 2D sprite is manipulated forward or backwards in an effort to simulate 3D movement toward and away from the screen. This can be achieved at the hardware level with specialized chips, or it could be done in software if you had enough horsepower and a developer with the skill to pull it off. If you have been a Sega fan long enough, you know they put a ton of effort into sprite scaling as far back as the late 1970s. When Yu Suzuki burst onto the scene in 1985, things took a far more impressive turn. His games looked three-dimensional and were some of the smoothest examples of the technology. As the years would pass, Sega would expand its capabilities and really bring out stuff that looked phenomenal. By the time the early 90s had arrived, the tech had matured into a sight to behold. Outrunners was as good looking as any early polygon racer and felt faster too. When Sega began talking about the Sega CD and its ability to manipulate sprites, I had visions of all kinds of great games coming home and using it. That didn't really happen, so the expectation then fell to their next machine, the 32X. With its powerful 32-bit processors, I was looking forward to not just the polygon titles, but also what could be done with superscalers. In this episode, we're going to take a look at some of the games that used sprite scaling, how they fared against their arcade and Saturn editions, and see if Sega's add-on had the stuff to do it impressively. I hope you guys enjoy sprite scaling and the Sega 32X. While the 32X library is really small, more games have some form of sprite scaling than you may think. World Series Baseball scales the entire field and players when the ball is hit, reminiscent of Neo Geo titles. It doesn't add anything to the gameplay beyond a cool visual feature, but it does give you an idea of what the platform was capable of. NBA Jam Tournament Edition used sprite scaling on the players as they moved from the front of the screen to the back, a subtle but arcade-accurate addition that made it feel more authentic. Knuckles Chaotix used sprite scaling in areas as well. It was mostly for gimmicks, but it was clear that Sega thought the addition made games more appealing. The 2D fighter Cosmic Carnage had full-screen scaling, again similar to Neo Geo games in the genre. The thing that really limited its use in games like these was the fact the 32X had no dedicated hardware to run side-scrolling titles, leaving the bulk of that work for the Genesis to take care of in many cases. This left things rather unimpressive since the Genesis couldn't display a lot of color by itself. But the 32X wasn't completely gimped in regards to sprite scaling. While the 2D side-scrolling stuff presented issues, we learned quickly that forward-scrolling engines were far more impressive. T-Mek was a port of an Atari-created arcade game. It's all about tanks and arena combat. You play from a first-person perspective and the entire engine is based on 3D movement using two-dimensional sprites. There's not a lot of color here and there is a ton of pop-in, but I think the engine is overall impressive considering Time Warner Interactive ported it quick and dirty on a cartridge that was 1/10 the size of the arcade ROM. The arcade version runs at a smoother frame rate, but the gameplay overall is faithful. You get dropped into the fray where you must battle other tanks with laser fire and missiles. It's not the best game on the 32X. Hell, I didn't think the arcade was all that great honestly, but I think it shows that the machine was capable of these types of games in general. Had a bit more time and polish been applied here, this could have been a real showpiece. Fortunately, Sega would get much better performance out of the 32X with their own titles. Shortly after the 32X arrived, Afterburner Complete showed up. Developed by Retubo Games, it was at the time the most accurate version of this game on a home system. The sprite scaling here is very accurate with a few concessions made. It runs at a lower frame rate but is still fast and smooth. I mean, look at this thing run. If there was ever an argument that Sega should have focused on sprite scaling for the 32X, this is all the proof you need. The fact that the 32X was doing all this in software does lend quite a bit to the argument that it had some untapped potential that is rarely shown off. Capturing the attract screen, I can get a near one-to-one match, and you can really appreciate just how well the 32X did with this title. The gameplay really does stand up, and the music is even rather well done. Vertubo Games would also do the Sega Aegis Saturn version of this, which is more arcade accurate, but I still have mad respect for the 32X edition. Since this came out just a few months after the release of the 32X, it likely had a really quick development cycle, so my hat's off to the developers for their accomplishment. If you have a 32X, this is one of the must-owns for the platform. Right around the same time the 32X received Afterburner Complete, it also got Space Harrier. Vertubo Games was back again as the developer, and once more they nailed the conversion. Like Afterburner, the frame rate isn't as high as the arcade, and there is some instances of slowdown here and there, but it is an incredible port overall. I captured the attract mode so you could see just how close this is to the Saturn edition. Impressive to say the least. Content-wise, it had the stages and the music, and it again sounded great, right down to the digitized speech. It's difficult to level any real critique here. It was the arcade version as far as gameplay, and the visuals and sound were close enough to make it the best home version available at the time. Along with Afterburner, these were two of my most played 32X games. Hell, I had a Saturn at the time and still played them. These games had been the pinnacle of arcade technology when they were originally released, and finally having a decent home version was something that really appealed to me. If you have a 32X, it's another must-own.
Get ready.
There are a few other 32X games that are similar in nature to Space Harrier and Afterburner Complete. BC Racers by Core Design was kinda like the Super Nintendo version of Mario Kart, using a third-person perspective. This engine is much less impressive than the Sega published titles we just went over, however. The screen movement is choppy, and the racers don't scale smoothly at all. It can still be fun, but every version of this title had performance issues, I'm afraid. Not really Core Design's best effort. Another early life release was Motocross Championship, a game full of potential but really fell flat in the gameplay and content department. No doubt this was another one that was rushed through development to get it out as soon as possible, and I think it showed a lot of promise of what could have been. The visuals themselves move fast, and the scaling on the bikers doesn't look bad at all. Had the gameplay been anywhere near as good, this could have been a must-own. Unfortunately, the collision detection is really bad, and the tracks all look the same. A few more months in development and this one could have been a lot better. There is evidence that Sega had a few more sprite scalers in development before pulling the plug on the 32X. Both Outrun and Power Drift were in various stages of creation at some point, and there are rumors that Galaxy Force 2 had begun development before being cancelled. While I do not think any of these would have saved the 32X from its ultimate fate, it would have been nice to see them represent the platform. I mean, Sega was wasting funds and resources on games that didn't really look any better than Super Nintendo titles. These sprite scalers would have at least been something to admire, and quite a bit better than what the Genesis was capable of alone. Had Sega doubled down on the sprite scalers at the time, we could have seen a home port of Outrunners, which could have drawn some positive attention to the capabilities of the unit. I have no doubt it would have needed to be cut back a bit for a home version on the 32X, but seeing Afterburner and Space Harrier makes you realize that at the very least, an acceptable version was possible. But beyond that, Sega had a ton of other sprite scalers it could have pulled from. The folly of picking Afterburner and Space Harrier were that they were older, and many in the gaming press considered them outdated. This is where some of the games from the System 32 could have really helped. Outrunners, Radmobile, Jurassic Park, Slipstream, and a few others could have brought some mad respect to the 32X lineup, even if they needed to be cut back some to make them happen. Mix in the Polygon games it was already receiving, and maybe the 32X could have sold a few more units and not been seen as the embarrassment it ended up being. Retubo Games seemed to have a great hold on the 32X technology, something not many developers at the time could claim, so Sega already had a group that could get results. I think they really missed a chance here to make the 32X stand out more. It was never going to be the success they wanted it to be, but it could have been so much more than it actually achieved. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.